All right, for the next hour and 20 minutes, we're going to talk about Sentinel event reviews, which is a topic near and dear to my heart, and we've got three wonderful and thoughtful participants to talk about them. So a Sentinel event review is a review that gets conducted, work with me, after a Sentinel event. What is a Sentinel event? So a Sentinel event in quality and manufacturing and transportation and healthcare is an event that is such a significant negative outcome or undesired outcome from a system that it calls everybody's attention to it. It's a signal that if something like this could happen, there must be quality or system problems throughout what we're trying to do, and we need to bring everybody together who was involved and try to understand it. And so in transportation, that might be a plane crash. Lauren Lipscomb yesterday from the Baltimore Conviction Integrity Unit compared a wrongful conviction to scissors being left in somebody's abdomen after a surgical procedure. And so that sort of never event in healthcare and a wrongful conviction in criminal justice, all of these things qualify as Sentinel events. And when the Quattrone Center got started, one of the things that Denise Fodoraro-Quattrone, our founders, said to me was, why don't we look at wrongful convictions the way people look at those events in transportation and healthcare? And it turns out that this got started in aviation, and lo and behold, with an ongoing process of reviewing errors, not necessarily to see who was to blame, but to take on what's called forward-looking accountability, right? The accountability that an organization has to say, regardless of whether there's somebody to blame, we don't want to let this happen again in the future. Right, that kind of forward-looking accountability. And when aviation took that on, plane crashes started dropping precipitously, even as more and more people were flying. And don't look now, but more and more people were flying because fewer and fewer planes were crashing. In healthcare, these never events have been going down as hospitals have taken on this as a cultural imperative. And it's starting to happen in criminal justice as well, whether it's officer-involved shootings, deaths in custody, wrongful convictions. And so the Quattrone Center, really since our founding, has tried to take those principles from those other complex human systems with dynamic information and lots of interacting teams and people and high-stress environments in which people's lives are at risk. And when I ask that, when I describe that, am I talking about the healthcare system, the transportation system, or the criminal justice system? Right? The answer is yes. And so the question we've asked is, can we take those healthcare principles, those transportation principles, and apply them in criminal justice? And in the late spring, early summer of 2020, of course, we had the horrible tragedy of the murder of George Floyd. And the protests that followed were unforeseen. I wouldn't say unpredictable entirely, but I think of a magnitude that surpassed everybody's expectations in cities across the country, and particularly in the cities of Madison and Seattle and some others. Those protests continued for months. And the three people that are on the panel with me participated in, and in some cases led and initiated in Madison and Seattle, event reviews where the Quattrone Center was fortunate enough to be able to serve in sort of a moderating and collaborating capacity. And so we wanted to share those experiences with you and have a conversation about those, and welcome your questions, of course, with the cards as we go forward. So let me just quickly introduce our esteemed panel. I'll go from my left. So we have Lisa Judge, who is the Inspector General of the City of Seattle. Karin Martin, a professor of public policy from the Evans School of Public Policy at the University of Washington, who also participated in the Seattle Review, and Assistant Chief Paige Valenta from the Madison Police Department. And so we're just going to chit-chat and see what we can do to help educate you guys and hopefully encourage you to begin to implement some of these practices in your jurisdictions wherever you might be. So let me ask Paige and Lisa, and by the way, there are no rules for this. I'm going to throw out questions and you guys are going to keep talking, and then sometimes I'll add something and maybe not. So Paige and Lisa, let me ask the two of you, as the leaders of the Sentinel Event Review process in your respective districts, talk about the internal conversations you had to use this process and to apply it to the event reviews, which is sort of a novel thing.
Paige, would you like to go first? Oh, well, Thank you, Lisa. Well, for us, what occurred in 2020 was the definition of what you require for a Sentinel event, and that is it was unexpected and it was incredibly impactful. Just as a little bit of background, Madison, Wisconsin is the capital of Wisconsin. It's home to the flagship university, University of Wisconsin at Madison. It is about a 4-hour drive from Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so when George Floyd was murdered, events in Madison became very challenging. We have a long history of supporting protests in Madison, a very active community. We're approximately 300,000 community members in Madison, and on any given day with the commuters moving into the city, it could be as large as 400,000. And the confluence of the distance that was created as a result of the pandemic. People were staying at home, they were self-isolating, and then coupled with the murder of George Floyd resulted in long-standing protests in Madison. I think we had about 180 days of protests almost every single day. And during the course of those 180 days, on 6 of those days that were interspersed irregularly throughout those 180 days, we did have moments of violence. We had times when people, were at grave risk of being injured. So when it came time for us to review how we had responded as a police department to this, we knew that this was the perfect event or series of events, and that we needed help to look and determine, what did we do well? Where do we need to improve, and how do we move forward from here? And we knew we needed the help of the community because they were so involved in what had happened, and to not include them in this process, I think would have dramatically undermined the legitimacy of any type of review process. And so we were very fortunate to work with the Quattrone Center. We had been put in touch with the Quattrone Center several months before, and we're contemplating a Sentinel event review of another incident. And then 2020 happened, and we just knew that it was right for Madison in terms of an opportunity for us to come together with the community to review what happened, create a document to analyze what we could do better, but what actually historically actually happened, because it was such a protracted event that frankly, we need some additional information in order to better assess how well we did. So we were very happy to have the opportunity to work with the Quattrone Center and help them facilitate interactions with our community.
Thanks. And thank you. Thank you for having me here. Good afternoon. You had asked the question, you couched it in terms of what were the internal conversations going on. And so just a little bit of background before I came to Seattle. The office has existed for 5 years. I started the office as a department of one 5 years ago, but before that, I was general counsel for the Tucson Police Department for almost 24 years. And so I had the benefit of working with a fairly innovative police department there who had started developing this notion of a Sentinel event review for critical incidents, officer-involved shootings, fatal collisions, things like that. So when I went to Seattle, had in my mind I was going to implement this process for officer-involved shootings. So I had, talked it up for the first couple of years I was there, and everyone thought that I was completely insane, and there was a high level of skepticism about it. But then, as Paige described, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, there were just sustained violent protests going on in my city as well, and trust between community and government had just been completely destroyed. So city leaders were looking to my office to develop a process to do some sort of review of this. And I thought, aha, here's the time that we will do this. But, as John has described, a Sentinel event is almost a self-defining thing. And so one of the frustrations and challenges that we had in Seattle, and probably Paige, your jurisdiction experienced this as well, is how do you identify a Sentinel event or a discrete set of Sentinel events when you've got months of sustained protests and violent uses of force, incidents that undermine public trust happening day in and day out, multiple times a day. So the planning of this took quite a bit of time. And for me, it really was a dual track that we had to pursue. We had to do the traditional look at policies, training, tactics, things like that to make those kinds of recommendations. And there was the relational component of it. We had to work on rebuilding trust between government and community, rebuilding relationships, and opening dialogue to problem solve together. So, really with those two components in mind, it was very important to me to design the process with heavy community involvement and to have community at the table in the review process. So we had a very robust period of engagement, trying to identify community panelists. Then we had panelists in our work group that helped us design the process and identify Sentinel events. Then we had another panel of police and community that came together to look at those events and identify contributing factors and make recommendations. So that's kind of how the process played out. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that was unique about the protests, often, let's look at a plane crash or a wrong side surgery. Like, those are discrete events. And as you both have said, one of the challenges here was we had 3 months or more of sustained protests. And so what each group, I think, independently sort of did was say, okay, well, a lot of those protests were relatively peaceful, and but some of these protests sort of crossed the line into where we are going to call it really that Sentinel event and review it. And we're going to look specifically at areas where force was used by or against community members, where lives were at risk, where substantial property was damaged. But we're going to look at it from the perspective of making sure we elevate the First Amendment rights to protest, right? What both departments, I think, said was where we think the error was in not allowing the protests to happen peacefully, and instead the protests got dangerous and violent. Is that fair?
I think that's fair to say, is that the undesirable outcome was the intervention or the need to intervene in violent conduct.
But there was then agreement with the community members around what precisely the errors were, and that was a necessary place to start.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would just add the element that I think, I'm not really sure how you identified Sentinel events, but I had a pretty good data team that aggregated everything we knew about the protests. And when you added in uses of force, reported uses of force, reported injuries, complaints, claims, lawsuits, social media feed, things like that, if you graphed that out, you could see very definitive spikes and very definitive waves of those spikes. So all of that said, we wound up divvying it into 5 separate waves of activity that we looked at, with Sentinel events identified within those waves. This work, don't be daunted if you hear this, by the way, this work took us over 2 years to do the review and resulted in 4 reports. So it can be scalable, but that's how we wound up having to eat the whale, as it were, with all of those various terrible things that were happening on a daily basis.
It's a good Pacific Northwest metaphor.
Not that we eat whales. Yeah.
So right, that would be wrong.
Metaphor.
Yeah. And I will say that, with the individual waves were shorter, and when we've done, more discrete events, that can be shorter. A wrongful conviction can be long because you've just got so much record to review and history of time, but that the reviews do sort of scale with the amount of material you have to review. So at that point, the decision is made. We have to have community involved to kind of have the legitimacy of the reviews go forward. One of the general precepts of these event reviews is we try to get as many of the actual participants, information from the participants as possible. Of course, with this sort of thing, you've got lots of community participants. So talk about, Karin, as a community participant, why you decided to participate in this at a moment of sort of widespread community cynicism about the very institution that we're looking at.
Because I was told it was going to be 6 weeks. And I said,
My best
yes. And then it turned into 10 weeks. Anyway, so I said yes because I thought it was going to be short. And then I quickly realized that this is a chance where stakeholders and people who don't usually cross paths were going to be crossing paths for a long time in a very real way. And so it was not just going to be a kind of performative, like, I have a thought, I have a feeling, let's move on, or like, let's draft a report real quick, and then it sits on somebody like Lisa's desk for a few years. The process itself was built in a way to really forge relationships between people who may not have any other opportunity to have a relationship. So I would never have met so many people at SPD at all the ranks that I did. And so to me, that was very compelling. So I said yes, because it seemed like an innovative approach to dealing with a public policy problem. And as a professor of public policy, I'm professionally obligated to seek out interesting public policy problems. And so it was a way to engage in I would say both rare and authentic way.
And so what's the pitch to a community member at a moment like that?
We need you. I mean, that's really the pitch. We need to hear from the community. We are public servants to the community. And we need to hear your voices, and we need to work with you to collaborate on what went well and areas to improve. But this process can't be legitimate without your participation. We reached out to a number of organizations in our community. I think we had a very good turnout. But it was the influencers in our community needed to be a part of this so that we could hear their perspective. The community members also really helped us identify our blind spots. You know, you put a group of law enforcement professionals into a room, and there is, to a certain extent, groupthink that happens, reinforcement of the same concepts over and over again. And by bringing in members of the community who ask questions that really make you evaluate, why do we do it that way? And it never occurred to me that we'd be perceived in this manner when our intent was to work in a different manner. And so that was just invaluable to us. I also think the important thing is, as well, is that I've lived in Madison almost my entire life, actually. Went away to school and came back, and it put me in touch with people that maybe I hadn't had regular contact with. And I developed relationships with those individuals where I really do feel committed to move forward with the recommendations that we crafted, because when I think of the review that we did and the recommendations, instantly I picture Tom and Ashley and some of the other people that we also spent months working with. And I feel not only committed because I want to make my agency better, but I feel a commitment to them as individuals, that we identified things that we can improve on, safeguards that we can put in place, that I feel like I've developed a relationship and have a commitment to those individuals to make sure that that happens.
So don't let us end without coming back to the 1-year anniversary conversation. Were you going to jump in?
I just wanted to say that when we were reaching out to community, it was really important to me to center the voices of people who have been historically impacted by policing violence and racism, and particularly to center Black voices in that conversation and in the planning, because, you know, there had been a lot of talk in Seattle throughout that summer about the message and the, you know, sort of the mission of Black Lives Matter and coming out had been a bit co-opted. And so it was really important to me to do that. So we compiled a list of, I think I reached out to over 150 organizations and individuals, and whoever would talk to me, I would spend time on the phone or going out to meet with them or whatever to talk with them about the process I was thinking about and about how important it really was to have community involved in creating this process and to having something that was legitimate for community and that was authentic in, you know, both the content of the conversations and what came out of it. So I think that was an important component for me.
So a lot of especially because race was so integrated and so intertwined with these events, and when you're doing a Sentinel event review, one of the things that you're doing is sort of walking backwards from an event to understand the contributing factors and the dominoes that fall to come together to cause this undesired outcome. In fact, in the literature about these things, there's a technique called the 5 whys, and it's WHY, 5 whys. And it's, you know, well, we had a protest and there was violence. Well, why? Well, George Floyd had been murdered and people were challenging the legitimacy of police, and the police then were telling them what to do. Well, why? Well, the police had a playbook and were used to fixed lines and they were preventing people from going where, you know, and you keep going backwards to why. And ultimately, in this case, you would almost always get to because there was systemic racism for decades. And so talk about how that gets confronted and what changes you can make to address that in a way that feels legitimate to community. Just to give you an easy one.
Yeah, no problem. So if this process could result in, the 5 ways you can get rid of racism, that would have been amazing, but that's not possible. And so I think what we had to do was, and I will say that in this process, it was really important to have good facilitation of these conversations, because we needed to be able to go down some rabbit holes and to, really explore some components of anger and mistrust and things like that, but have a moderator that would bring us back to identifying contributing factors and moving us down the road toward making implementable recommendations. But for us, we really needed 2. As I mentioned, there were dual considerations for me, and so we had John moderating sort of the process of it, the Sentinel event review components and how we got to an end result. But we also used peacemaking facilitation, which, if any of you had known me 5 years ago, you would have said, what? Who are you? But I was introduced to that concept, and I thought that's going to be a critical way to create a space where people respect each other, where people listen and feel heard about things. So that was a really important piece. And I'm sorry, John, I forgot your original question because I'm just so excited about all of this stuff.
I think you're answering the question. Let's
okay, great.
Hear from our other colleagues.
Well, I think that was, as you identified, the facilitation was extremely important. And I think we all perhaps came into the process a little cynical. Like, what are we going to get from this? And I think there was some consideration of, we're not going to fix structural racism in the United States. What's the value of having this conversation? We're not going to fix structural racism in Madison. But I think what was really important about what we set out to do and the guardrails that occurred in the conversation is, what can we do? And what we can do is examine processes and systems to make sure that in this particular area, we can reduce the impact of some of those harms that are happening in society. And you can walk away with achievable results that's important and valuable and can change the way that the police and the community interact. And I think that was what was an incredibly important process of building consensus, problem solving together, building those relationships was extremely important. And I think we started with some cynicism of what can we truly accomplish, but ended the process feeling very empowered by what we did.
Yeah, and I would add that, racism and police violence was always the backdrop for the conversations that we had. And very early on, I think, Karin, you identified that we were speaking different languages, what the police, their conceptions of racism and racial bias and what community had in lived experience were often very different. So if you could just talk, Karin did a whole facilitation for our panel on how do we talk about racism and those issues with each other in a constructive way.
Yeah, I was going to add, to me, it was interesting hearing you both say, like, what can you do in the face of structural racism? And I actually saw the panel or the SER as being this little microcosm, because if you can't address structural racism with like 2 people or 8 people, then you're certainly not going to do it in society. And so I took away from the relationships that we had, it was very interesting to see how trust, I wouldn't say like we got from 0 to 100, but what was seemed healing for everybody was to actually feel heard and to do some listening that maybe wouldn't have happened outside of the group. So for community members to hear Seattle Police Department employees talk about, like, oh, I guess I can see how that would look racist to you, basically. And that's, that's not what happens usually. And so what I was observing that you mentioned earlier was that people we were speaking different languages. And so there was the lived experience of, like, being in a minoritized body or living in an area that feels over-policed, or living in an area you don't feel like you can be policed, or having a business in an area where you see police treating your potential customers in a certain way, versus SPD that came into this system articulating a stance that was a little bit to us versus them for the other members of the group. So it was feeling very confrontational and like SPD could do no wrong right? And so anything that you say, well, we have the policy for it, and so therefore it's not wrong. And so eventually getting to the place and being like, okay, you might have the policy, but we could challenge those policies. Like those policies are emblematic, could be emblematic of structural racism, as opposed to just always defending them or hiding behind them and saying it's okay because it's legal, to be able to say, like, can we all have a conversation about how maybe the policies themselves need to be addressed?
Yes, this is saved for later, the key takeaway. But what Karen's talking about was, I think, the biggest aha moment for me. We've heard legitimacy talked about for the last couple days. Thank you, legitimacy. And so, one of the things what Karen is talking about is the police have this identified measure for legitimacy, what's lawful. They always talk about things, well, that's lawful. We have policy for this. We have a law for this that supports our actions. And so procedurally, they feel like they are legitimate. What is legitimate in the eyes of community? That perceived legitimacy is often very divergent. And so that gap in legitimacy was the thing for me. I was like, that's what happened. The gap in the legitimacy that officers felt in acting the way they did and the legitimacy that community perceived there was way off. And so the work that we can do is to bring those closer into alignment. And I don't know if you want to say any more about that, Karen, but that legitimacy gap was my biggest takeaway.
No, you said it perfectly.
Sorry.
Oh, okay. So you said it perfectly in that. Yeah.
That's fine. So talk about, Paige, a little bit about how you get police officers to be prepared to hear that, right? Because I'm sure after 90 days of protests, right, the police have, and this is something that happened in both cities, right? Those weren't pleasant interactions for anybody. There were lots of people shouting and screaming and saying all sorts of things, and projectiles being thrown, and the police were doing things. And so it was an us versus them environment for a lot of that period of time. And now we're going to bring police and community together. And you're the senior officer on this team, and you're bringing in officers who really need to be able to have this process and really need to be able to hear that and allow that space to happen so that community members feel heard and have that validity. So how do you go about doing that?
Well, I guess I can't understate enough. I think that there was some apprehension in how this process was going to work. And we're in 2023 now, but let's harken back to 2020 a bit, when the national dialogue of policing and community members was so broken that many people felt that the only way that they could move forward was to go into the street, protest, and demonstrate and use their constitutional rights. And for some people that extended to property damage, and sometimes people got hurt. So it is in that context that happened outside that now we're coming inside together and bringing those same people who perhaps really struggled to have effective communication outside. And now we're bringing them into a room and focusing on the very topic that is in fact so straining and draining and challenging, and we're hoping that we're going to have productive discussions. I think a very positive thing was some of the ground rules that were laid out right away, and we started. We hear about corny kind of icebreaker conversations, and I thought the first day that we got together for a meeting and we got an assignment. I haven't been in school in a long time, but we got an assignment, and it was write an essay about you at your best. And we came back as a group the following week, and we shared those essays. And what was really amazing to me is, first off, we did this over Zoom, right? The pandemic is in full swing. We're not meeting in person, and we all know, having been through it now the last couple of years, how limiting Zoom can be in personal. But this particular exercise actually had people crying, and it immediately took people out of their roles, the roles that they had come to this meeting in, whatever that might be, and it humanized people right away. And I think that was extremely important. And then we had the rules that you'd hope that would occur in any conversation, right? It's confidential and it's private unless there's some explicit statement that we're going to share the information today. Please don't interrupt other people. Try not to take things personally. And this is, again, very challenging topics for people to come in and talk about. And so I think that guided process was extremely important and a very helpful and powerful facet of the entire process that we went through.
Yeah, I will say that that exercise is called the positive introduction exercise, and I've done it with a bunch of environments. It's the only exercise I've ever given to more than 10 law students where I haven't gotten at least one piece of negative feedback. They're just always complaining about something. But doing it over Zoom with a bunch of people who'd never met across that divide was a white knuckle moment for me, for sure. Lisa, in your process, and Karin, in your process, you created that emotional space a little bit differently. So talk a little bit more about Sarome and the peace circles and how that worked, and Karin, the impact from your perspective.
Yeah, so we worked with an individual named Sarome Fong and an assistant that he had, and he has done quite a bit of work. He is a formerly incarcerated person, had been involved in gang violence earlier in his life, and had kind of made it his life's work to learn and practice peacemaking in a variety of different venues where, relationships are contentious. I think he worked in prisons and those kinds of environments. So when I met him, he was just such a calming person and had this way of making you feel at ease, making you feel like you could share difficult things. And so, that the selection process was really easy for me. It was a little bit of a tougher sell. The Pacific Northwest is decidedly more woo-woo about things like that than the East Coast. So it wasn't, it would probably be received differently here, I would say. But I think that, once we all met together and had Sarome sort of do some guiding of us through initial peacemaking principles and, talking stick kinds of principles and setting ground rules, it was very comforting, at least for me, to have that balancing presence.
Yeah, I would just add that he basically kind of embodied this restorative justice approach to interacting. And we didn't use the term restorative justice, but it was definitely about healing relationships, even if you didn't have a specific individual relationship with somebody, like healing the kind of community police relationship in a broad sense. And then the way that this time was structured, so we would check in for sometimes up to a half an hour, where there's an actual visual on our shared screen with each person's name, and a little arrow would go around the circle, so everybody has a certain number of minutes to kind of talk about where they were, how they were entering the space that night. And then we would do the same thing at the conclusion. And so even the content of that was always interesting to kind of know where people are, where they were coming from that day, but it also just set a tone of kind of equality. This is a circle, we're all connected, we all literally need to hear from everybody here for this to work. And so setting that stage and doing that for so many months on end, again, it was you always heard at least something from everybody, usually at least twice. And that also just kind of, I think, was a good warm up, right? Oh, okay, I'm talking, I'm sharing in this space. And so to me, I took away from having him do that, this restorative justice aspect of how to interact, and setting the expectations and setting the culture of the group was very helpful.
Yeah, and we definitely invested time in it. The first 8 hours that we met was peacemaking. So, the tone at the outset was, this is important. This is how we're going to work together. This is our model. And so, I think everybody who came into it understood how critical it was going to be to fostering respectful, effective communication with each other.
And also, after 8 hours of meeting people, you just have to like them. Or really, really not.
Yeah, I was going to say that. So this is one of those things where you're constantly learning things about this process. It had never been as explicit as you just made it, that the check-in and check-outs made sure that everybody was speaking, and therefore that you were implicitly honoring every voice, that was around the circle, which ends up being really important, because I think ultimately what we were doing was asking people to voluntarily engage in challenging and sometimes sort of dangerous conversations. There was a pretty substantial risk in these conversations that you were going to say something that intentionally or not, often not as we got to know one another, but that it was going to really offend somebody, really upset somebody, really subject you to criticism. And asking people to participate, that is asking them for generosity. And so it was a way of honoring, I think, that generosity that each person in the group was giving to one another. And, you know, for me as the moderator, I have to say, like, a half hour at the start and a half hour at the end, I was like, come on, can we please get to it? But I think creating that space in both contexts was really important. Let me ask you, Paige, because you were in the operations center a lot of those nights, and you were watching the events go on and get to those results. And then you were coming in and participating in this event where everybody was talking about all the mistakes that the police had made and all the things that they could do better. And so talk to me about that process and how that integrates with the process for you as a participant in the events.
It was an incredible responsibility is what it felt like. Having been in the command post for many of the events and participated in the decision-making in the events, I felt like I had a lot of context, and I was able to provide information that probably wasn't available through any other source. The details that we knew at the time, the factors that were going into the decision-making, the evolution of events as they occurred. We didn't police the same way on day 1 as we did on day 90 or day 180. We learned and we adapted as we went, and I felt like that was incredibly important information to share so that people understood what we were trying to do, the areas that we had success. I was incredibly proud of the men and women of the Madison Police Department and how they handled themselves in some incredibly challenging and difficult situations. But what I increasingly was aware of is that it really required me to make myself vulnerable and to try and almost disassociate myself from a decision in order to have a conversation to, in a sense, grade my own work. And that is very challenging. But at the same time, I thought it was very important as well to have that additional context. And I think that that vulnerability, you referred to it as generosity, and I think that it was paid forward by community members in particular who recognized that is a difficult and challenging situation, but it really also humanizes the decisions that we all make as well. We have a tendency, I think, to view each other exclusively in the roles that we play. We make attributions, whether they're fair or not. And in this circumstance, it also was somewhat cathartic to try and explain, this is what we knew at the time, this is what we were trying to accomplish, and this is the outcome.
And so, you know, Lisa and Karin, again, we had, at any given time, 5 different members of the Seattle Police Department. Talk about, you know, again, how that was structured and that process, because, you know, of the various tenets of this, one of the things is you want to avoid speculating on why people did things. And so one of the challenges of this is, how do you get the actual decisions from the actual people? Because, of course, those are the things that we want to change, right? It's all well and good to change a policy, but what you really want to change is when something's being thrown at you, the decision to too quickly move to a use of force when you could still de-escalate. And the policy is only part of what might be going through somebody's mind at that time. So we've got the then participants in the room. How did you guys think about that and talk about that?
That was a really compound question, John. I will say I'm old and I confuse easily.
Yeah, this is not a deposition. You can just answer however you want.
Yeah. So I would say that actually, I don't know what I would say. Karin, do you want to start first and maybe give your perspective? And I need to synthesize my
Jump into if you want.
Yeah.
It was very interesting having all the SPD and different ranks of SPD there. And I think that was actually one of the stickiest points in our process, was getting past the policy. As I mentioned before, often the policy was said, well, this was the policy, so we're okay. And community members being like, that's ridiculous. The policy ended up with bad things, so the policy is not okay. And so being able to get to that place of everybody kind of taking responsibility for the decisions they were making under the policy, and being able to open up some space to consider that there were other decisions that could have been made. And I feel like that was a thing that took a very long time with SPD, and that there's a lot of resistance, and even with community members, to realize like everybody was making decisions in those very fraught, high anxiety, tense moments, and to see that there was a place to like maybe have a pause, and that everybody could have made different decisions, but the onus being on SPD, because they are representing the government in that moment. They are the ones that are supposed to be protecting the rights of people to protest. They are the protect and serve entity. And so they actually had a little bit more of an onus to make the right decisions and to protect people. And so to me, like having SPD there, trying to get to that place of introspection, it was like kind of a moving target. Like it happened, and then you'd see the retraction, and then it'd happen again. And like, yay, that person's getting it. Oh no, they're not. And so it would be interesting. And then seeing new people come on, because we met for a couple of years, so some people would cycle off and on. And so it would be interesting to see the new SPD is like, oh, they haven't quite gotten to that place of accepting that there's another way to see what happened that day, or they haven't gotten to that place to see this as non-threatening, and to see that we're not in the blame game here at all, and that what we're trying to do is unpack and understand. So to me, that was just very interesting aspect of interacting with SPD over such a long time, and seeing the places where it was easy for people to agree and then easy to not agree, and then what it took to like get to that place of like acceptance of like, oh, there is actually another way to see what seemed very black and white before, because this was the policy, we followed the rules, what's there to talk about, and for that, just that opening to happen, for people to be like, okay, I can see that there's at least something to discuss.
Yeah, and I think we were fortunate to have at least one, if not two, for a period of time, of the actual incident commanders at many of these events as part of the panel. And so I think it gave them an opportunity to really hear the community perspective of the impact what they did on them, and it gave the panel the opportunity to have more information that might otherwise be available just through police reports, body-worn video, things like that. So it allowed for a fuller conversation. And then, if any of you were thinking about doing a process like this, you're not limited to the participants, right? So at various points in time, we invited certain community members to come and talk with the panel and answer questions. We had certain guest appearances by police personnel who were in like the Emergency Operations Center or other things come and join us and answer questions and share perspectives from that. So, I think just in terms of that kind of fullness of information, it's important to think about who is going to be on your panel, who you also might want to hear from. It was important to me to have all ranks represented in this on the police side, so that you could have executive level people giving the 35,000 foot perspective, and community service officers and line officers also to have the person standing out on the line perspective of what was going on. The same with community members. We had, a professor, we had a person who was actively involved in the protests on a day-to-day basis, people involved in community housing. So a lot of perspectives there too. And I think it's really critical to get a two-way conversation going, because if any of you have ever watched a police department do a review like this, they're like, training policy, check, check, check. Yep, we followed all of our own rules. Great, we're good to go, right? But here we had people in the community, when officers said, we declared this situation a riot, we ordered dispersal, people didn't move, therefore we did what we're allowed to do by law. And then to have community people saying, we couldn't hear you. Nobody in the back could hear what you were ordering us to do, and so they weren't moving, and so we couldn't move. So it's really important to have two sides of the conversation as part of this.
And I think it was also really important because it also validated what we did well. And we had a lot of conversations about what went well and why did it go well. And then we looked at it from a policy standpoint of, okay, we're going to look at process. We know that it went well with these people in the room making the decision. But if there were different people in the room at a different time, would they make the same decision? So how do we write policy in order to make sure that there's sufficient guardrails so the things that went well won't go poorly in the future? And so I think certainly that's the forward-looking aspect of this, that I think we look at the non-blame aspect of this review, which is a really important part, because you want people to participate and you want there to be collaboration and consensus building. That's really an uninviting environment if people don't feel like they're going to be heard when they come into that environment. And so focusing on things that went well also was an important aspect of what we did.
Yeah, and I think, so I guess a couple points to pick up on. Maybe the first one to pick up on is other people around the table. So what we did for in each of these groups was we had some other subject matter experts. So you had Cliff Stott, and maybe just talk quickly about who he is and what he added to the process.
Yeah, sure. I think in the early days of the protests, it went from people coming out to protest the murder of George Floyd to very quickly protesting their own police departments in Seattle. You know, the protesters very quickly turning on the Seattle Police Department, and the Seattle Police Department having no idea what was going on. And so, you know, just the levels of violence that were going on made it really clear that people didn't accurately understand what escalates and de-escalates a crowd, and how to manage that level of violence and anger when it's directed at the police. So we identified a crowd psychology expert from the UK, Professor Clifford Stott from Keele University, who became part of the training that we did for the panel to kind of level set and help us all understand current social science around crowd psychology and crowd behavior. He wrote a paper for us. He also did a scientific analysis of the events of that summer so that we could have it as a companion piece to our Sentinel event review reports. But, you know, just being able to understand why people behave the way they do and what things you can or shouldn't do that impact that behavior was really helpful in coming up with recommendations. And, you know, SPD really got caught flat-footed. They were Seattle's probably one of the protest capitals of the United States. And I think at the time they thought, we know exactly what we're doing. We've got this nailed down. You know, on day 2, they were like, we have no idea. Help us, please. We weren't, tell us what to do. So having experts, subject matter experts, help you is a critical part of the process.
Well, and I think that was really well said, and it's important. We had an experience in Madison where we too, as a community, have been traditionally extremely supportive of First Amendment rights. In fact, we have something called the Madison Method, which is almost a national standard for how to handle protests. We've had events in Madison that certainly have contributed to a lack of trust at times in our police department. And during those events, we've been able to actually march with the protesters, almost acting as parade marshals. We have had a very good history of communicating with our community in order to keep people safe while they express their constitutional rights. But things were different this time, and we had to utilize and evolve to a less is more approach in how we tried to keep the community safe while people exercised their rights. We were unable to march or to walk with protesters because the sight of a police officer was inflammatory. And that really impacted our ability to communicate with people. And so we, much on the fly, perhaps similar to Seattle, we're in a situation of what we've done before is not working. How do we need to adapt and overcome in order to keep people safe? Because that was our number one job, keep people safe and protect their constitutional right to express themselves in the community. And that was really challenging because as John said, the vast majority of protests were peaceful in as much as they didn't have violence and they didn't have property destruction or damage. But sometimes there were violent individuals that were amongst the protesters and actually hid themselves amongst the protesters. And it was really difficult for us to try to extract those individuals, try and leave untouched the people that are out there exercising their rights, but remove the person that's harming people, that's setting things on fire, that are breaking windows in order to keep people safe. So we really did see an evolution of our tactics and our interaction with the community. And I'll just segue that one of the things that we discovered was sometimes the police can't go out and walk in the protest with protesters because it's so inflammatory. And we were trying to figure out, how do we communicate with people when that is the case, that people won't talk to you and in fact are very angry with you. And that's when we started the process of having an intermediary, trying to work with some of our community influencers that could help communicate concerns that we had about people's safety, but were able to act as an intermediary so that the sight of a person in uniform or the communication style that was had, how do we get to the point where we can have really important conversations to keep people safe and everybody be on the same page?
Yeah, and I think that, one of the questions that came across is sort of what changed, and there's a lot to talk about in that topic, but let me take this one because it illustrates something that's interesting. Particularly in Madison, there was a lot of conversation in the community while we were going through our process about the Quattrone report, and it really made me uncomfortable because a big precept of this is that it's the jurisdiction's report, right? It's the consensus of the community and the police, the agencies in the room. And we were there as a moderator to help the community come to consensus on how it wanted to move forward. And one of the ways you decided to move forward with the community was to have community representatives who were known to be communicating with the command center in the crowd, right? So that you could get that communication. You had the same problem, but came up with a different consensus solution.
Yes, and it was largely informed by Professor Stott's work in the UK, in Sweden. We wound up working with the South Korean government at one point in this. I mean, it just became this crazy, massive global effort. But communication is really, I think what you said is less is more in terms of police presence, in terms of how hard their uniforms are, and then making sure that your communication is actually effective. I think those were the two things that really came out as the most meaningful things that SPD could address. And in terms of communication, having people in the crowd who can provide a two-way feedback loop to police decision makers, so they're making the right tactical decisions, either to try to go in and interrupt actual violence, or to stay out and not escalate the crowd by, presence that's not wanted there, was really critical. So Professor Stott has developed a program called dialogue policing. And at first I thought that sounded really terrible, like fashion police or something. But, it's really about having police department employees who are wearing softer uniforms, who are working before, during, and after events to build relationships with community members so that they have a real-time feedback loop with what's going on in crowds, so that you can, know when it's prudent to come in and interrupt violence, when it's much more prudent to just stay back and wait for another time. So I think those things are really critical developments that came out of it.
So let me circle back and pick up on words that I think you've all used to describe this process. Let me talk about the words blame-free. So when we talk about a blame-free process, when we've gone through 90 days of community unrest, and antagonism with police, maybe not everybody's in a blame-free mood, right? Accountability is something we hear in policing all the time. When we talk about blame-free event reviews, people are like, well, what are we going to do that's just here? So talk about what that word means in this context for each of you, and how you approach that issue of accountability versus blame-free.
I think anytime that you offer critique to a human being, they can tend to hear it as blame, or tend to personalize it. So I think what we did well in the report was we stuck to the facts when we were describing what had happened, and didn't assign motivations to those things. And then I think it's important for accountability purposes is we didn't focus on individuals, but we came in with a presumption that the system and the police department had caused harm. That, there was an acknowledgement that bad things happened, and they happened because the police department was not responding in a way that was appropriate to and for the community. So I think acknowledging the systemic harm and the organizational harm that is being inflicted on community was a way to take the blame and acknowledge systemic blame, but then not, focus on individuals and how what they did on X day could, caused whatever harm.
Yeah, I would add that even if somebody didn't use words like it was your fault or because like assert causality to somebody's behavior, sometimes things were still heard as if blame was in the ether. And so I think the blame-free culture of the group was that everybody was kind of on board with like being able to see that for what it was when it happened. Like that's, defensiveness from past experience, not necessarily necessary defensiveness for this moment, because nobody's actually blaming you. Like that's not what the intention is in real time. And so when there was defensiveness, it seemed like it was much more kind of representing some group. So like being defensive on the part of protesters, or being defensive on the part of SPD, or being defensive on the part of government. And so being able to hear people talk about like maybe justifying what happened without personalizing it, and being able to say, in that conversation, say like, basically like, thank you for explaining that, because, community members don't know SPD policy and SPD doesn't know what the protesters are thinking. So being able to like acknowledge just the explanation aside from blame. So I thought in our group, there was a lot of, I feel like we had a lot of talking about explanation that to me was trying to get around the blame.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think we were really validated on some of the things that we did right as well, and I think that's an important part. We focused a lot on processes and not people. And then I think when there was concern about blame, we also reminded participants, and particularly the police participants, that this process was to focus on their action, because they're the professionals and they're the one that are charged with the responsibility and accepted the responsibility to try and deal with these very complex situations. And we were not there to try and change anyone but ourselves. And I think that was an important thing to keep in mind.
So I think,
can I add one more
please.
thing on the blame thing is I realized like not only were people kind of defending, but everybody kind of also took responsibility for like their group. So like SPD would be like, oh, I can see why that guy did that. Or a community member would be like, I can see why that protester did that. And I think that was helpful for everybody. So it was not everybody retreat to your corners and defend your stance. It was really this engaging and trying to understand why what happened. So it was kind of like the process thing, but it's also like the people understanding people's decision making. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you. And there's an element I think that that you didn't add that I might add to it a little bit from my perspective, and feel free to correct me if you disagree. We were looking at use of force reports, and in Madison we were able to actually interview officers and prepare for this, so that we were able to sort of say, well, here was the use of force report, and the officer involved explained that their intention was X, Y, Z. Now, one could be cynical about the content of those reports, and sometimes people were, but there was an explanation given, and there was administrative actions that had been taken for some of those officers. You have the Office of Professional Accountability, and we were reading their reports of a lot of these events to get that perspective to sort of say. And so the arc of the conversation would be, we're going to watch video of an event. Right? Everybody would do that. Now, anybody who's watched an NFL football game knows that you could have a cajillion cameras of incredible precision, and guaranteed the Eagles won that Super Bowl. Right? There were errors made. We all saw them. Right? Unless you're a Kansas City Chiefs fan, in which case the Eagles definitely lost that Super Bowl. Okay, whoever just wooed. My point being that two people can see the same video and arrive at completely diametrically opposed conclusions about what has just happened, right? So we would start by seeing the video. Then we would have a conversation where we would sort of say, okay, everybody, what did we just see there? And then we would have a conversation where the police, the more senior police, would generally say, well, let me tell you what I would expect to have happen there based on policies. And sometimes what you would have expected to have happened is what happened, in which case Karin would say, well, this is a bad policy. Right? Or sometimes the police would say, well, that's not what I would have expected to have happen. And whether it was from the administrative process of the use of force or OPA, you had the ability to say there is an accountability process. And I think that freed this group up to sort of communicate that to the community and then say, now, how do we stop the next police officer and the next community activist from being in this situation? And I think in my mind, that's what blame-free, also means. It doesn't mean we're not going to, call balls and strikes. We're not going to be objective about things that need to change in an individual's behavior under the circumstances. But we're also going to look at how that person found themselves in that situation with the assumption that they're not necessarily an evil person. Is that?
Well, and I think it was very productive to have conversations because I think we were able to hear different perspectives. And a classic example of that was we had an instance when some officers, more than a few, I would say 5 or 6, took a person into custody. And it was interesting to hear from the community, the perception was that the more officers who were involved in taking a single person into custody, the more likely that person was to be harmed or suffer a significant use of force. From a police perspective, we would like to have better odds because the chances are that you will not be hurt because we're able to control you more quickly. But the perception of some people in the community was that we were ganging up on individuals, when in fact our intent in the outcome of these situations was that far less force was used in many of them. So I think just having those conversations and hearing what is your intent and what does it look like was important for us.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, Lisa, but just to repeat the point, right? I think it often revealed differences between, the way I kind of thought about it in my mind, between the test that the police thought they were studying for and the test that the community was administering, right, weren't the same test. And I think that was particularly clear. One of the differences between Seattle and Madison was that Seattle had a 3-week Occupy period called the Chop Chaz. And so maybe the two of you could talk a little bit about the conversations we had there, within that context, because I think that was a really challenging period of time.
Mm-hmm. It was a challenging period of time, and it was an incredibly challenging period to review. In the other 3 waves that we produced reports on, we were producing reports about what SPD did and how they could do things differently. This was a period of time where SPD was absent. It was in the Capitol Hill occupied zone, or the CHOP is Capitol Hill
Occupied Protest and Autonomous
Occupied
Zone.
Protest and Autonomous Zone. Yeah. So it was the police department had vacated a precinct, boarded it up, left a whole neighborhood without police protection that then became sort of surrounded by barricades. And it was really difficult to get any sort of public safety services in or out of there, garbage collection, all kinds of city services that the people in that community needed were absent during that period. So also absent was any information, data, body-worn video, police reports, anything. So we had to rely on interviews with community members, going out, talking to residents, having residents come and talk to the panel and really provide the information that we were looking at to analyze a couple of events. We had a couple of deaths occur in that time, and some of the contributing factors there was the inability to get ambulance services in to extricate those folks and provide medical attention for them. So it was really difficult from a data perspective, and it was difficult to talk about what the absence of government and the absence of critical services to a neighborhood really means. And I think John and I were, can I say this? We were discussing this over bourbon last night. That, it was that sense of the community saying, get out of here, we don't want you, but we're mad at you for abandoning us because we still need certain services that you provide. So there was this interesting irony in that.
Yeah, that incident, I'm thinking of when the young man was shot and the people in the Chop Chaz kind of took him so far, and then the ambulance was not allowed to go across the barrier. And so there was a lot to unpack there, because once again, the policy was like, it's not safe, you can't go there. And so somebody basically died because of lack of timely medical care. And so again, like that is a place where, you know, the literal people involved were not in the room, but there was certainly an urge to want to assign blame because the stakes were so high. But we didn't. Well, we fleetingly did, but then we got away from the blame. But then to me, that was a place where I don't know that like there was any really consensus, right? Like that was a place of pretty intense tension to feel like the point of the police, the point of EMT is to save lives. And here's a chance where you didn't because of a policy that is in place to protect the safety of the first responders, right? So you can't argue the logic of the policy, but that's a pretty intense contradiction, right? Like whose life is going to have more value in that moment. So I don't know that we have like, everybody felt happy with like what we came up with, but the focus on contributing factors was very helpful and productive, right? To be able to articulate in very detailed way what led to that situation and ways to perhaps avoid it in the future. So to me, that was a big value add.
And I think, I mean, hopefully with contributing factors, what you end up doing is taking this big emotional impact event and breaking it down into easier to address points. And I think one of the challenges, I'd be curious to know what any of you think about this. One of the challenges of that is when we approach something like that, and one of the things that we did in each of these groups is we said, look, if systemic racism is a very difficult thing to get at, I think, in an event review, because you're trying to understand why people are actually making decisions. Once you decide that somebody is intentionally making decisions because of because they're racist, it becomes very difficult to have a conversation. And you're also sort of, nobody's going to say one way or the other. So the way we tried to handle that was to say, if you see systemic racism, call it out. Because whether or not, we're not going to get involved in lobbing the accusations, but if you see it and perceive it, that's what we want to fix, right? We want to avoid that perception. When you're dealing with something that emotional, to then say, well, we need a new policy for how ambulances come into an area is not very emotionally satisfying, right? And to your, like, it doesn't make me feel like, oh, well, we really got to the core of this one, right? But if we had been able to get that ambulance into that place, then perhaps people would have had a different perception of the event. So I find myself in that sort of chicken and egg of, I don't believe that the tactical solution solves the raw emotion that comes from that event, but perhaps these are steps that we could take to prevent people from perceiving the event that way.
Yeah, I don't think there's always a fix for something, but certainly naming it and speaking about it and speaking out about it is the first step, right, to moving toward some sort of solution or improvement in a condition that we find unacceptable.
I would say there was a lot of naming systemic racism. I mean, there was a lot, because the situation was a very racialized situation, right? And because it was a very racialized situation, there was no moment of any of the protests that was race-free. Like that's just a delusion. So I think we were constantly raising that decisions were made in this context of a racialized situation. Systemic racism is always with us. Some of us are more and less aware of it at any given point in time, but you can never say, oh, there was no racism involved in any way, shape, or form, because the whole protest was a racialized event.
Well, and we had one person in Seattle who was just so great at always saying, if you don't remember why we were all here in the first place, we are just mowing the lawn. Right? And that was a useful thing to kind of come back to basics and be like, look, all of this. And so one of the questions we have here is, you know, to what extent did the group think about the lots of community warnings that might have been there, that a tipping point was close, right? And so is there a way to see warning signs from this process that might lead you to, okay, we're going to get to more protests against the legitimacy of the police again, right? What do you all see as far as when you think about prevention, right? What are those warning signs, and to what extent do you feel like we got at that in the process?
Well, and I think that was the nuance of 2020, was that some of the signals that we perhaps had in place to become aware of these things were broken because we were in a pandemic, and literally you stood more than 6 feet apart from one another, and people were working from home, and people were feeling a sense of anxiety and frustration and fear that, I think contributed to the incendiary situation that we had. But I think what it reinforces for us is that even in those very challenging situations, even if we have to use an intermediary in order to continue these conversations, that's really important. I think when George Floyd was murdered, our department came out and made a statement along with the other departments in the area that this was horrific, that it was unacceptable, that it's not something that we would tolerate. We tried to have, I think, some conversations, but clearly, those lines of communication were damaged at that point.
Yeah, communication was a big one, and figuring out how to effectively communicate with your community on an ongoing basis so that you have relationships that you can go to when, things start to look like they may be heading toward a violent protest kind of situation or something. But the other thing that was crystal clear to me is the Seattle Police Department, and probably the vast majority of police departments in the country, are operating on very outdated notions of crowd behavior. That whole notion of mob psychology and mob mentality where everybody, it becomes a monolith of violence and anger. It's just not true. It wasn't even factual at the time. I think that it was created, but it has become this foundation for American crowd policing. And so I think just getting to real science behind why crowds behave the way they do, encouraging police departments to differentiate peaceful yet angry protester behavior from violent behavior that can, like setting fires, assaulting people, things like that. That's the kind of behavior you should be trying to differentiate and target if you can, without moving into a crowd and making everybody else feel like you're not behaving legitimately and turn on you. So I think that is a big takeaway that can help police departments do things differently in the future.
So why don't we move to that, right? What were things that the process changed, and did it live up to the promise when you started, right? Do you feel like we got to recommendations for change that the group could agree with that were different than another process might have generated? And at the risk of asking a compound question, are there areas that we didn't get to that you wish we had? So answer any of the above.
Yeah, I think really the racism piece was really hard, and I felt very unsatisfied with where we ultimately got there, and it was very paradoxical in these events, because really, except for the killing of Horace Lorenzo Anderson, the young man who was killed in the Chaz Chop, almost all of the events that we analyzed were harm to white protesters or white police officers. And so that became a real topic of frustration for community panelists who were like, we're still having to do this analysis through the lens of protecting white people there. And so I think we just kept having to come back to, trying to weave the component of racism and police violence against Black and brown people into it. But it felt very unsatisfying at the end for me.
Yeah, I think that because racism, structural racism was kind of the fuel for the fire. And so we kept talking about the fire without talking about the fuel. And the fuel's still there. It's still there right now. And so I think it's that's the world we live in. So I felt partially okay-ish about it sometimes. I do feel like there were good conversations, and I'm sincere when I say that the fact that I could hear SPD and other hear community members reflect back the harm that they had inflicted, or they could see that was a thing that existed, as opposed to just feeling like, no, we didn't do it because we followed policy. To me, that was a step in the right direction, right? That doesn't solve racism, but to be able to have that level of pause and level of reflection, to me, was very valuable. And I think everything starts with individuals. And so even if those, 4 to 8 people, I don't know exactly how many SPD we ended up having there, even if they personally are the only ones that had some change, I still think that's the beginning of something very important.
I would say our experience, or at least mine, was that I walked away with a little bit more of a positive experience. I think we were intentional about setting those boundaries, that we knew we were not going to fix structural racism in Madison, but what could we do to have as much an effect on it in these particular circumstances? We walked away with, I think, a total of 69 consensus recommendations. Those recommendations not only went to the police department, but they also went toward other city agencies and city at large as well. And I think that we walked away feeling like, at least my experience was, and I got the sense from the other community members, that we had made a positive change. And I think the relationships that we built were strong enough that a year later we came back. So we issued the release of the consensus recommendations, and the report authored came out on November 16th of 2021, and on November 16th of 2022, I think you got an email in your inbox, and I said, John, you would love to come to Madison, Wisconsin in February. Isn't that on your bucket list? Because we want to tell you about everything we've been doing during that 1 year period, because we were proud of what we did. Again, I think the difference between Quattrone Sentinel event review and perhaps the traditional after action is, again, that relationships that are forged. As an executive in a police agency, I feel an obligation to move forward with, these were consensus recommendations, which means I believe in them as well. And it's my responsibility to make sure that they're carried out to the fullest extent that I can do so. To date, we've made substantial impact on 61 of the 69 recommendations, and the ones that we haven't been able to fully accomplish or complete are ones that we may not be able to act on as individuals, because we maybe don't have the budgetary authority right now to be able to accomplish that, or the recommendations aren't addressed at MPD, but perhaps the city at large or the fire department, because we did look at a comprehensive analysis. And I think that was really rewarding. I think all of our stakeholders, with maybe the exception of one who had a last-minute conflict, actually returned, and we walked them through the presentation to say, this is what we've done. And I mean we, the collective we in this room, and what you accomplished. Again, we didn't fix structural racism in Madison, but we accomplished a great deal in order to influence that. If we walk down, if this confluence of events happens again, are we going to walk down the same path that we did in 2020, or are we going to take a different road? And I think that was really validating. I'm hopeful. It was validating for me, for our community members who I still stay in touch with, because I think that there has to be a sense of hope, that we can do better. The collective we can do better together.
Well, that's awesome. And I think I'm glad you didn't let us leave without the 1 year anniversary. But I think, we've talked about the restorative justice aspect of it, and we've touched it in different ways, but I want to be explicit and, tip my hat to Tom Tyler and Caroline and your center and its lineage. The procedural justice aspects of this were big from, throughout, right? Announcing what the process was going to be to the stakeholders, then living up to that process. And what Madison did, and I, love to take credit for this, but this was not a Quattrone thing. This was entirely a Madison thing, to say a year later, here's how you're going to know that this wasn't a report that went on the shelf, because we're going to tell you. We're going to issue a report, recommendation by recommendation, and we're going to tell you, for recommendation 1, yes, we did this. For recommendation 2, this is in process. For recommendation 3, well, this is, a tough one for us. It's not entirely us, or we don't, whatever, but here's the reason, right? So not just the what, but the why when you weren't able to get there. And to issue that, I think, is an important follow through, and one that, since Wave 4 just came out, 2 weeks ago?
It's been longer than that, but
the Wave 4 report
time is relative.
was published pretty recently,
yes.
Right? Certainly not within the last couple of months. So a 1 year anniversary, I think, is in our future. But I think circling back like that and living up to that commitment, and part of the context for doing it the way we did in the first place, and having these senior officers like yourself and other assistant chiefs in the room, and doing so from multiple departments, whether it's the fire department, whoever else, is so that as the community is coming up with, as by community I now mean everybody around the table, because of course police and fire department, they're community members too, in a sense, right? So that it's a little bit of a false separation, and hopefully by the time you get done with this. But the idea was that having those senior people in the room would mean that the department then was aware of the recommendations that were being generated. And because they participated in it too, you were going to get through all of the later downstream objections that you might have. Oh, we can't do this because of X. Oh, here's some unforeseen consequences, right? And you would actually create implementable and desirable recommendations in that process. Is that, you feel like that was accomplished?
Definitely. Yeah. We, I think, generated in excess of 150 recommendations over the span of 4 reports. And I have regular meetings with the Seattle Police Department's policy unit, and they've got a huge matrix with all of the recommendations and the status, the varying statuses of implementation. So we're moving forward. And I think, that idea that you had of doing it publicly is a great one. So yeah, we're going to steal that. We'll do it.
Okay. So anything else that we should cover that you guys want to get out there? Really, I think this has been an amazing conversation. I just don't want to miss anything.
So much. We could talk for hours about this, but no, I think this was a great opportunity. Thank you very much, John and Quattrone Center, for having us here.
Well, you all did the work, so please thank our panelists.